Chapter 1. The Devil's Music, February 14th, 1929. Chicago, Illinois. A bitter wind howls down North Clark Street, carrying with it the city's frozen breath. It is 10:30 in the morning, a time for honest work, for deliveries, for the mundane rhythm of a metropolis grinding through the last dregs of winter. At 2122 North Clark in the Lincoln Park neighborhood stands a red brick garage, unassuming and grim. The sign above the door reads SMC, Cartage Company. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of motor oil, stale cigar smoke, and cheap whiskey. This is the headquarters for George Bugs Moran's North Side Gang, the last significant rival to the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld. Within these cold walls, 7 men wait, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They are a mix of seasoned gangsters and hangers-on, men like Peter and Frank Gusenberg, enforcers with reputations for violence, and Adam Hayer, the gang's bookkeeper. They are expecting a shipment of hijacked Canadian whiskey, a prize in the city's brutal undeclared war over illegal liquor. The promise of Prohibition, the noble experiment, had been a nation cleansed of spirits. The reality was a city drowning in them, a river of untaxed gold flowing into the coffers of men willing to kill for it. And no one was more willing, more organized, more ruthlessly efficient in this new economy of violence than Alphonse Gabriel Capone. But on this morning, Capone is 1,000 miles away, basking in the sun at his Palm Island estate in Miami, Florida. He has a perfect, verifiable alibi. He is meeting with the Dade County solicitor, a picture of civic-minded relaxation. He is untouchable. Back in the cold Chicago garage, the men hear the squeal of tires. A police car, a Cadillac touring sedan, pulls up to the entrance. 5 men emerge. 2 are dressed in the dark blue brass-buttoned uniforms of the Chicago Police Department. The other 3 are in civilian clothes, long overcoats, fedoras pulled low, to the Moran gangsters inside. This is a shakedown, a routine raid. Annoying, but not deadly. They are ordered to line up against the north wall, their hands raised high against the cold, grimy brick. They comply without a fight. They know the script. A few hours in a holding cell, a fine, a call to a lawyer, and they'll be back on the street. They are professionals. They understand the rules of the game, but today the rules have changed. The men in overcoats are not detectives. The men in uniform are not police officers. They are assassins, dispatched by a distant king to deliver a message written in lead. The garage doors are pulled shut, plunging the interior into a dim, dusty light. From outside, the only sound is the low rumble of a passing truck. The world does not know what is about to happen. The 7 men facing the wall have no idea that their lives are being measured in seconds. This is not a raid, it is an execution. In the chilling silence, 2 of the men pull out Thompson submachine guns, the infamous Chicago typewriter. The heavy, brutal weapons are raised. The metallic click of the bolts being drawn back echoes in the cavernous space. For a fleeting, final moment, the 7 men must have understood the betrayal, the finality. The game was over, and then the devil's music began. A storm of .45 caliber rounds, a deafening percussive roar that rips through the silence, tearing into flesh and brick alike. Over 70 rounds are fired in a matter of seconds, a relentless, methodical annihilation. The men slump to the ground, a tangled heap of overcoats and blood. The executioners are calm, professional. They walk over to the pile of bodies. Frank Gusenberg, impossibly, is still alive. One of the shooters leans down, places the muzzle of a shotgun to his head, and delivers the final deafening punctuation mark. The 2 fake policemen then march the men in civilian clothes out of the garage with their hands up, a perfect piece of theater for any curious onlookers. It looks like a routine arrest. The killers climb into their car and drive away, melting back into the city's fabric. Inside the garage there is only silence, broken by the slow, steady drip of blood onto the concrete floor. The St. Valentine's Day massacre is over. It is an act of such calculated brutality, such shocking violence, that it will stun the nation and change the course of American history. It will cement Al Capone's reputation not as a bootlegger, but as a monster. It will make him public enemy number 1, and it will ultimately be the beginning of his end. The seeds of his destruction are sown in this bloody garage, 1,000 miles from the Florida sun. He had reached the absolute zenith of his power, a monarch ruling through terror. But in doing so, he had finally made an enemy he could not intimidate, could not bribe, and could not kill: the United States government. The roar of the Tommy guns on North Clark Street was an echo of Capone's own voice, a declaration of his supremacy. But it was also a funeral dirge, playing softly in the distance, for an empire about to fall. Chapter 2. The Scars of Brooklyn. To understand the man who could order such a massacre from 1,000 miles away, one must travel back in time to a world far removed from the blood-soaked garages of Chicago, back to the crowded, teeming streets of turn-of-the-century Brooklyn, January 17, 1899. Alphonse Gabriel Capone is born, the fourth of 9 children, to Italian immigrants, Gabriele and Teresina Capone. They are not the impoverished, desperate peasants of so many immigrant tales. Gabriele is a skilled barber from a respectable family near Naples. Teresina is a seamstress. They came to America not to escape starvation, but to seek opportunity, to build a better life in a land that promised everything. They settled at 95 Navy Street, a cold-water tenement in the shadow of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was a world of grit and noise, of 100 languages clashing in the air, of coal dust and horse manure, of ambition and despair packed into suffocating proximity. This was the crucible that would forge the boy they called Al. Young Al was not, by nature, a delinquent. He was bright, well-dressed, and by all accounts, a dutiful son to his strict but loving parents. He attended public school 133, where he showed promise. But the streets of Brooklyn had their own curriculum, one that taught lessons far more valuable for survival than anything learned in a classroom. The neighborhood was a patchwork of ethnic enclaves, each with its own gangs, its own codes, its own fierce loyalties. The Irish, the Jews, the Italians, they coexisted in a state of simmering tension. For a young Italian boy, respect was not given. It was earned, often with fists. The formal education of Al Capone came to an abrupt end in the 6th grade, at the age of 4. The story, now part of his legend, is that he was struck by a female teacher, and in a fit of rage he struck her back. He was expelled and never returned to a schoolhouse. Whether this act was one of defiant pride or simple, brutish anger, its effect was the same. The door to a conventional life, the life his parents had crossed an ocean for, had slammed shut. The streets now became his only teacher. He took on a series of odd jobs: a clerk in a candy store, a worker in a bowling alley, a cutter in a bookbindery. But these were dead ends, offering little more than pocket change, and the suffocating prospect of a lifetime of anonymous labor. The real money, the real power, was elsewhere. It was in the world of the gangs. Capone fell in with small-time hoodlums, the so-called South Brooklyn Rippers, and the 40 Thieves Juniors. But his real apprenticeship began when he caught the eye of a man who would become his lifelong mentor, a gangster of unusual intelligence and vision. Johnny Torrio. Torrio was different. He wasn't just a thug, he was a strategist, a businessman whose commodity was vice. He saw the future of organized crime not as chaotic street brawls, but as a structured, syndicated enterprise. He ran brothels and gambling dens under the protection of Paul Kelly, the sophisticated leader of the Notorious 5 Points gang in Manhattan. Torrio saw something in the burly, quick-witted teenager from Navy Street. He saw ambition, a capacity for violence, and a nascent intelligence that could be molded. Capone became Torrio's protege. His first real job was as a bouncer and bartender at a squalid saloon on the Coney Island waterfront called the Harvard Inn. It was owned by a man named Frankie Yale, another of Torrio's associates, and a rising power in the Brooklyn underworld. The Harvard Inn was a rough place, a nexus of sailors, prostitutes, and criminals. It was here, in this violent, smoke-filled room, that Capone would receive the wound that would define his public image for the rest of his life. One evening, a small-time tough named Frank Galluccio was at the bar with his sister Lena. Capone, ever the brash young man, made an insulting remark to her. Accounts vary on the exact words, but they were offensive enough for Galluccio to demand an apology. Capone, full of youthful arrogance, refused. Galluccio, enraged, pulled a knife and slashed Capone across the left side of his face 3 times. The wounds were deep, requiring dozens of stitches. They would heal, but they would leave 3 livid, parallel scars that would forever mark him. From that day on, the press would call him Scarface, a nickname he despised. He would try to hide the scars in photographs, turning his right side to the camera. He would later claim they were war wounds, a lie that fooled no one. The scars were a permanent public reminder of a lesson learned in blood, that even the toughest man can be laid low by a moment of disrespect, that violence is a language everyone in his world understood. The incident with Galluccio could have ended Capone's career, or his life. But Frankie Yale, a man who valued pragmatism over pride, summoned both men to his office. He ordered Capone to apologize to Galluccio, which he did. He then paid Galluccio $1,000 in compensation. The matter was settled. It was a lesson in diplomacy, gangster style. But Capone's capacity for violence was not diminished. In 1917, he was involved in a fight that resulted in a man's death, with the police asking questions, and with another potential murder charge hanging over him. His time in New York was running out, It was then that Johnny Torrio, who had since moved west to a city ripe for the picking, sent for him. The city was Chicago. In 1919, the United States ratified the 18th Amendment, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The law was meant to usher in an era of sobriety and moral righteousness. Instead, it created the single greatest business opportunity in the history of American crime. Johnny Torrio, now established in Chicago, understood this immediately. He was working for Big Jim Colosimo, the city's preeminent vice lord, but Colosimo was old school. He was content with his empire of brothels and gambling. He saw prohibition as a risky federal matter, one best left alone. Torrio saw it as the future. He needed an enforcer, a loyal lieutenant he could trust, someone with brains and muscle. He needed Al Capone. In 1920, Capone, with his wife May and their young son Sonny, left the grime of Brooklyn behind. He arrived in Chicago, a city on the verge of an explosion. He was just 21 years old, a young man with 3 scars on his face, and a deep education in the brutal calculus of the streets. He had no idea that he was stepping onto a stage that would make him the most famous and infamous criminal in the world. He was entering a city of boundless opportunity and unimaginable violence, a city that would give him everything he ever wanted, before taking it all away. Chapter 3. The Gold Rush on Lake Michigan. Chicago in 1920 was a city of raw, unbridled energy. It was the hog butcher for the world, the nation's great railroad hub, a metropolis built on steel, sweat, and ambition. It was a city of towering new skyscrapers and sprawling, squalid slums, and with the dawn of Prohibition on January 17, 1920, it became the epicenter of a new American gold rush. The Volstead Act, the law enacted to enforce the 18th Amendment, was riddled with loopholes and exceptions. It was a sieve trying to hold back an ocean of thirst. The demand for alcohol did not disappear. It simply went underground, creating a black market of staggering proportions. An army of brewers, distillers, smugglers, and distributors rose to meet this demand. They were called bootleggers, and they were about to become the new aristocrats of crime. When Al Capone arrived, the city was already a complex tapestry of criminal enterprises. Johnny Torrio, his mentor, was the chief lieutenant to Big Jim Colosimo, who ran a vast network of brothels, particularly the crown jewel, Colosimo's Cafe on South Wabash Avenue. Colosimo was a flamboyant figure, dripping in diamonds, a lover of opera and fine food, but he was a man of the past. He saw no future in bootlegging. There's a saying, he reportedly told Torrio. The man who sells whiskey will end up in the gutter. This difference in vision was a death sentence. On May 11, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was waiting in the vestibule of his cafe for a supposed delivery. A gunman stepped out of a phone booth and shot him behind the ear. The murder was never officially solved, but the suspicion fell squarely on Torrio and his new enforcer from Brooklyn. With Colosimo out of the way, Johnny Torrio inherited the entire empire, and Al Capone was his right-hand man. Torrio was the architect, the quiet, methodical planner. Capone was the muscle, the field general. Together they set out to conquer Chicago's illegal liquor trade. Their operation was a masterpiece of vertical integration. They controlled breweries, importing expert brewers from Germany. They managed fleets of trucks, driven by armed guards, to transport the beer and spirits. They established a network of speakeasies, hidden saloons that catered to everyone from factory workers to the city's elite. And most importantly, they secured the necessary political protection. Chicago was a city for sale. The mayor, William Hale Big Bill Thompson, ran a notoriously corrupt administration. Police captains, judges, and aldermen were all on the payroll of the gangs. An arrest was merely a temporary inconvenience. A conviction a rarity. A monthly payment to the right official ensured that the river of alcohol flowed uninterrupted. Torrio and Capone's organization, which would later become known as the Chicago Outfit, was not just a gang, it was a corporation. It had departments, managers, and a clear chain of command. Capone, with his sharp mind for logistics and numbers, proved to be a brilliant executive. He ran the day-to-day operations from their headquarters, a 4-story building at 2222 South Wabash Avenue, which served as a brothel, saloon, and gambling house. But Chicago was not an open territory. The city was carved up among various ethnic gangs, each with its own turf. To the north were the Irish, led by the charismatic and cunning Dean O'Banion. O'Banion was a different breed of gangster. He was a devout Catholic, who owned a flower shop across from a cathedral, a convenient front for his bootlegging, and a source of lavish wreaths for the funerals of friends and enemies alike. To the west were the Genna brothers, known as the Terrible Gennas, Sicilians who specialized in producing low-quality moonshine in the tenements of Little Italy. And there were others, the Saltus McCurleen gang, the Sheldon gang, all vying for a piece of the billion-dollar pie. For a time, Torrio's diplomatic approach maintained a fragile peace. He brokered a citywide truce, dividing the territories to avoid costly wars. But the profits were too vast, the ambitions too great. The pressure began to build. The first cracks appeared in the suburb of Cicero. In 1924, the outfit decided to move its main base of operations there to escape the heat from a new, reform-minded Chicago mayor. They aimed to take over the local elections, ensuring their own hand-picked candidate would win. The election of April 1, 1924, became a scene of open warfare. Capone's thugs descended on Cicero, kidnapping rival poll workers, intimidating voters, and stuffing ballot boxes. The violence was so blatant that the Chicago police were called in. A gunfight erupted, and Capone's older brother Frank was killed in the crossfire. Ali was devastated, but the objective was achieved. Their man won, and Cicero became Capone's personal fiefdom, a lawless town where his speakeasies and casinos operated in the open. The takeover of Cicero demonstrated the outfit's raw power and shattered the uneasy truce in Chicago. Dean O'Banion, feeling squeezed by the outfit's expansion, decided to make a move. He double-crossed Torrio in a brewery deal, setting him up for a police raid and arrest. It was a profound insult, a public humiliation. Torrio, the diplomat, had been played for a fool. The response was inevitable. On November 10, 1924, 3 men, including, it is believed, Frankie Yale from New York, walked into O'Banion's flower shop. O'Banion, busy clipping chrysanthemums, greeted them with a smile. One of the men shook his hand, holding it in a firm grip while the other 2 drew their pistols. They fired 6 shots into him, one for good measure into the back of his head, as he lay on the floor. The killing of Dean O'Banion was not just another gangland slaying, it was a declaration of war. The North Side gang, now leaderless, would not let it stand. They wanted revenge, and their rage was directed at the 2 men they held responsible, Johnny Torrio and his ambitious lieutenant, Al Capone. The gold rush on Lake Michigan had turned into a bloodbath. The city was now a battlefield, and the streets would soon run red with the blood of men fighting over barrels of beer. The era of diplomacy was over. The era of the Tommy gun had begun. And in the center of the storm, a young man from Brooklyn was about to find himself on the throne of a violent, glittering empire, a position that would require him to be more ruthless than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 4. A Symphony of Killers. The Chicago of the mid-1920s was a grand, bloody opera, and its stage was populated by a cast of characters as ruthless and complex as any in fiction. At the center of it all stood Alphonse Capone, no longer a mere enforcer, but a rising power, a man whose name was beginning to be whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. He was becoming a public figure, a paradox in pinstripes. He dressed in flashy, custom-made suits, wore a massive diamond pinky ring, and tipped extravagantly. He cultivated an image as a benevolent businessman, a provider of a public service the government had foolishly outlawed. He would tell reporters with a straight face, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want." And later, more famously, "All I do is satisfy a public demand." He was charming, quick with a smile, and possessed a volcanic temper that could erupt without warning. His public persona was a carefully constructed facade, masking a capacity for violence that was both strategic and deeply personal. His mentor, and the reigning king, was Johnny Torrio. The Fox, as he was known, was Capone's opposite in many ways. Where Capone was flamboyant, Torrio was discreet. Where Capone was impulsive, Torrio was methodical. He was the grand strategist of the outfit, a man who preferred negotiation to war, but who would not hesitate to eliminate a rival if diplomacy failed. He envisioned a national crime syndicate, a federation of gangs operating like a corporation, minimizing conflict and maximizing profit. It was a vision far ahead of its time, but one that would be shattered by the raw, primal ambitions of the men around him. The primary antagonist in this drama was the North Side Gang, the Irish powerhouse that controlled the lucrative territories north of the Chicago River. Their slain leader, Dean O'Banion, had been a formidable figure, but his successors were in some ways even more dangerous. The first to take the mantle was Henry Wojciechowski, better known as Jaime Weiss. Weiss was a cold, calculating killer, a devout Catholic who reportedly carried a rosary in one pocket and a pistol in the other. He hated Capone with a religious fervor, blaming him not only for O'Banion's murder, but for the death of his own brother. It was Weiss who is credited with coining the nickname Scarfaces in the press, a deliberate insult he knew would infuriate Capone. He was intelligent, implacable, and utterly fearless. Capone himself was said to have remarked, "You could have gotten Weiss to pull the trigger on the last man on Earth." He was the only man Capone truly seemed to fear. Weiss's second-in-command was George Bugs Moran. Moran lacked Weiss's strategic mind, but he made up for it with a brutish, unpredictable violence. He was known for his hair-trigger temper and a deep-seated hatred for the Italian gangsters he derisively called the Greasers. While Weiss was alive, Moran was a loyal soldier. After Weiss's death, Moran's leadership would prove to be less disciplined, more chaotic, a fact that Capone would eventually exploit to devastating effect. These were the major players, the kings and princes of the underworld, but their armies were composed of a symphony of killers, each a specialist in the art of violence. For the outfit, Capone had men like Machine Gun Jack McGurn, born Vincenzo Garibaldi. McGurn was a handsome, athletic former boxer, who became one of Capone's most trusted and deadly assassins. He was a man who moved comfortably in both the glitzy world of jazz clubs and the brutal back alleys where disputes were settled. It is widely believed that McGurn was the lead planner and one of the executioners in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, an act of revenge for an earlier attempt on his own life by the Gusenberg brothers, who were Moran's top hitmen. Then there were the enforcers, men whose loyalty was absolute and whose methods were terrifying. Men like Frank Nitti, the enforcer, a quiet, businesslike figure who would later rise to lead the outfit after Capone's imprisonment. He was less of a street brawler and more of a manager of violence, ensuring the organization's rules were followed and its enemies were neutralized. On the other side of the law, the forces of order were, for the most part, compromised and ineffective. Mayor Big Bill Thompson's administration was a cesspool of corruption. The police force was largely on the take, with officers acting as lookouts, bodyguards and enforcers for the very gangs they were supposed to be fighting. A common saying of the time was that there was more law at the end of a policeman's nightstick than in a decision of the Supreme Court. However, there were exceptions. A few honest cops and prosecutors fought a lonely, dangerous war against the tide of corruption. And as Capone's power grew, a new, more formidable enemy began to take notice: the federal government. In Washington, President Herbert Hoover was growing increasingly frustrated by the headlines coming out of Chicago. The city's lawlessness was a national embarrassment. Hoover famously told his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, "I want that man Capone. I want him in jail." This directive set in motion a two-pronged attack. The first, and more famous, prong was led by a young Prohibition agent named Elliot Ness. Ness was tasked with assembling a small hand-picked team of agents who were considered incorruptible, the Untouchables. Their mission was to disrupt Capone's bootlegging operations, to raid his breweries and warehouses, to hit him in his wallet. Their exploits, while heavily romanticized later, were a constant source of irritation and financial drain on the outfit. The second, and ultimately more successful, prong was far less glamorous. It was led by a quiet, methodical investigator from the Treasury Department's Special Intelligence Unit, an accountant named Frank J. Wilson. Wilson's weapon was not a Tommy gun, but a ledger book. His task was not to prove that Capone was a bootlegger or a murderer. Everyone knew that. His task was to prove that Al Capone, a man who lived like a king, had never filed an income tax return. This cast of characters, the ambitious mob boss, the vengeful rival, the cold-blooded assassins, the corrupt politicians, and the determined federal agents, was set on a collision course. The city of Chicago was their arena, and the prize was control of an empire built on whiskey and blood. Each player was driven by their own code, their own greed, their own desire for revenge. It was a complex and deadly game, and the rules were being written and rewritten with every bullet fired. The symphony of killers was tuning up, and its crescendo would be a massacre that would shock the world. Chapter 5. The Weight of the Crown. The war for Chicago began in earnest after the death of Dean O'Banion. The North Siders, under the icy command of Jaime Weiss, launched a relentless campaign of terror against the Capone-Notorious syndicate. The streets became a shooting gallery. Car chases with blazing Tommy guns, a tactic that became known as the Chicago drive-by, were a near-daily occurrence. The body count climbed into the dozens, then the hundreds. For Al Capone, this was the crucible that would test his nerve, his cunning, and his capacity for brutality. He traveled everywhere in a custom-built, 7-ton Cadillac, complete with bulletproof glass and steel armor plating. It was a land battleship, a testament to the constant danger that now defined his life. In September 1926, Weiss's gang made their most audacious move yet. As Capone was eating lunch in the restaurant of the Hawthorne Inn, his Cicero headquarters, a motorcade of 8 cars filled with Northside gunmen drove slowly past the building. For a full minute, they unleashed a storm of lead, firing over 1,000 rounds from Tommy guns, shotguns, and rifles. The building's facade was shredded, windows shattered, plaster rained down from the ceiling. Capone, showing remarkable calm, was thrown to the floor by his bodyguard and escaped without a scratch. He later remarked of the shooters, "There was a lot of lead in the air, but they were lousy shots." The attack, however, shook him deeply. It was a brazen, direct assault on his throne room. A few weeks later, on October 11th, 1926, Capone's men struck back. As Jaime Weiss and his associates crossed a street near the North Side Gang's headquarters, the old O'Banion flower shop, gunmen opened fire from a second-story window. Weiss was cut down, killed instantly. The only man Capone feared was gone. With Weiss dead, leadership of the North Side Gang fell to the hot-headed and less strategic Bugs Moran. A temporary, fragile peace settled over the city. But the event that would truly change the course of Capone's life, the moment that would thrust upon him the full weight of the crown, had occurred earlier that year. On January 24th, 1925, Johnny Torrio, the brilliant strategist, the man who had brought Capone to Chicago, was returning to his apartment with his wife. As he stepped out of his car, he was ambushed by Weiss and Moran. He was hit multiple times by shotgun blasts and revolver fire. As Moran stood over the bleeding Torrio, ready to deliver the final shot to his head, his gun jammed. The attackers fled, leaving Torrio for dead. But Torrio survived. He spent weeks in the hospital recovering from his grievous wounds. The experience changed him. He had seen the face of his own death, and he no longer had the stomach for the war he had helped create. After his release from the hospital, and after serving a 9-month sentence on a Prohibition charge, Torrio made a decision that would alter the landscape of American organized crime. He summoned Al Capone. He told him, "It's all yours, Al, I'm through. It's all yours." And with that, Johnny Torrio, the Fox, retired. He handed the keys to his multi-million-dollar empire of vice, gambling, and bootlegging to his 26-year-old protege and left for Europe with a fortune. Suddenly, Al Capone was the undisputed boss. The weight of the crown was now his alone. It was a moment of immense opportunity and immense peril. He was the king, but his throne was surrounded by enemies who wanted him dead. His response was to centralize his power and increase his public profile. He moved his headquarters from the suburbs of Cicero to the heart of Chicago, taking over several floors of the luxurious Lexington Hotel at Michigan Avenue and 22nd Street. From this command center, which the press dubbed Capone's Castle, he ran his empire with an iron fist. He held court like a monarch, meeting with his capos, politicians, and reporters. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a celebrity. He attended boxing matches and horse races, where he was cheered by the crowds. He opened soup kitchens during the Great Depression, feeding thousands of unemployed men, a calculated act of public relations that earned him the goodwill of the common people. A reporter once asked him about his business, and he famously quipped, "I'm a public benefactor. You can't find anybody in Chicago who's got a beef against me." This was the great contradiction of Al Capone. He was a beloved public figure and a ruthless killer. He was a generous philanthropist and a brutal tyrant. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman operating outside a foolish and hypocritical law. He believed he was providing a service, and that the violence was simply a necessary cost of doing business in a competitive market. He once tried to explain his philosophy to a journalist. "They talk about me not being on the legitimate. Nobody's on the legit. You know, your brother or your father gets in a jam. What do? You fix it, don't you? You bribe somebody, don't you? I've been called a bootlegger. I've been called a gangster. I've been called a killer. All I'm doing is supplying a public demand. I'm just a businessman." This self-justification was the core of his worldview. But as his power and fame grew, so did the scrutiny. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was still in his future, but the decisions he was making in the mid-1920s were setting the stage for it. He was consolidating his power, eliminating rivals, and corrupting the city's institutions on an unprecedented scale. He had reached a level of influence that no gangster before him had ever achieved. He was the CEO of a shadow government, a man who controlled the city's vices, and through them much of its political machinery. The young man from Brooklyn, the bouncer with 3 scars on his face, was now the king of Chicago. He had the power, the money, and the fame he had always craved, but the crown was heavy, and the path to keeping it would demand ever greater acts of violence, acts that would eventually draw the unforgiving eye of an enemy he could not bribe, intimidate, or kill. The decisions he made in the gilded suites of the Lexington Hotel would lead directly to a cold brick garage on North Clark Street, and ultimately to a lonely cell on an island rock in the San Francisco Bay. Chapter 6. Annihilation on North Clark Street. By the winter of 1929, the uneasy peace in Chicago's underworld had fractured beyond repair. The primary source of friction was, as always, territory and profits. Bugs Morin's North Side gang, though weakened by the loss of Jaime Weiss, remained a persistent and dangerous thorn in Capone's side. They continued to hijack Capone's liquor shipments, a practice that was both costly and a deep personal insult to the King of Chicago. For Capone, the situation had become intolerable. Morin was not a man with whom he could reason or negotiate. He was a direct threat to the stability and profitability of the outfit. A decision was made, likely in the warm, sun-drenched climes of Capone's Florida estate. The Morin gang had to be eliminated, not just weakened, not just intimidated, but utterly and completely annihilated. The plan that was conceived was a masterpiece of gangster ingenuity and ruthless deception. It was likely masterminded by Machine Gun Jack McGurn, Capone's trusted killer, who had his own personal vendetta against the North Siders. The key to the trap was a simple lure, a stolen shipment of high-quality old log cabin whiskey, offered to Morin at a bargain price. The bait was set through an intermediary, a semi-independent hijacker. Morin, ever greedy, took it. The delivery was scheduled for 10:30 in the morning on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, at the gang's headquarters, the SMC Cartage Garage on North Clark Street. The date was chosen with a cold, ironic sense of poetry. The execution team was hand-picked. It consisted of at least 4 men, a mix of Capone's own Italian gunmen and outside professionals, possibly killers from the St. Louis-based Egan's Rats gang, hired to ensure they couldn't be easily identified by any potential survivors. They procured a stolen police car and 2 police uniforms. This was the stroke of genius in the plan. A raid by actual Chicago police was a common occurrence, something the Moran gangsters would not find immediately alarming. It would allow the killers to get close and disarm their targets without a fight. On the morning of February 14th, the trap was set. The temperature in Chicago had plunged to 18 degrees below zero, with the wind chill. The city was frozen solid. Inside the garage at 2122 North Clark, 7 men gathered. There was Adam Hayer, the gang's business manager, Albert Kochelik, also known as James Clark, Moran's second-in-command, and the Gusenberg brothers, Frank and Peter, 2 of the gang's most feared enforcers. Also present were Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who had abandoned his practice for the thrill of associating with gangsters, Albert Weinshank, who managed the gang's cleaning and dyeing fronts, and John May, a mechanic who worked on the gang's trucks. The one man who was not there was the primary target, Bugs Moran. As the fake police car pulled up, Moran himself was approaching the garage. He saw the police car, and assuming it was a raid, ducked into a nearby coffee shop to wait it out. This simple chance event saved his life. He would later tell reporters, "Only Capone kills like that." Inside, the 7 men saw the uniformed officers and the plainclothes detectives enter. They likely sighed with weary resignation. They were ordered to line up against the north wall. They complied, turning their backs to their executioners. They were professionals, and this was part of the job. They had no reason to suspect this was anything other than a routine shakedown. The killers had achieved perfect tactical surprise. What followed was not a gunfight. It was an extermination. The 2 men with the Thompson submachine guns, the Chicago typewriters, opened fire. The sound inside the brick echo chamber must have been apocalyptic. The high-velocity .45 caliber slugs tore through the heavy winter coats, through flesh and bone, creating a whirlwind of death. The killers were methodical, sweeping their fire back and forth across the line of men. Peter Gusenberg was hit at least 22 times, James Clark 20 times. The others were similarly riddled. They fell in a bloody, tangled heap on the oil-stained concrete floor. The shooters used 2 types of ammunition drums on their Thompsons, a 20-round box magazine and a 50-round drum magazine, ensuring they would not need to reload during the slaughter. After the initial barrage, 2 of the killers stepped forward with shotguns and fired into the pile of bodies, a final, brutal insurance policy. The entire event lasted only a few minutes. The killers then executed the final part of their plan. The 2 men in civilian clothes were marched out of the garage with their hands in the air, escorted by the 2 uniformed policemen. To any witnesses on the street, it looked as though the police had successfully raided a bootlegging den and were taking 2 suspects into custody. It was a flawless exit. The killers got into their Cadillac and drove away, disappearing into the city. Back inside the garage, there was a horrifying stillness. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood, but incredibly, 1 man was still alive. Frank Gusenberg, despite having been shot 14 times, was conscious when the real police arrived, drawn by the frantic barking of John May's dog, Highball, who had been tied up in the garage and was the massacre's only unharmed witness. Sergeant Thomas Loftus knelt beside the dying gangster. "Who shot you?" he asked. Gusenberg, adhering to the gangster's code of silence, the omerta, even in the face of death, whispered his final words. Nobody shot me. He died 3 hours later at a local hospital. The news of the massacre spread through the city like a shockwave. The sheer scale and savagery of the killings horrified even a populace desensitized to gangland violence. This was different. This wasn't a shootout between rivals. This was a cold-blooded, systematic execution. The press had a field day, dubbing the event the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The graphic photos of the slaughter, showing the 7 bodies lined up against the bullet-pocked wall, were published in newspapers across the country, bringing the reality of Chicago's gang war into American living rooms. Al Capone, 1,000 miles away in Florida, expressed surprise and sorrow when questioned by reporters. "I'm out of town," he said. "I don't know a thing about it." His alibi was airtight. He could not be placed at the scene, but no one, not the police, not the public, and certainly not Bugs Moran, had any doubt about who was responsible. He had achieved his tactical objective. The North Side Gang was shattered, its leadership decimated. He was now the undisputed absolute ruler of Chicago's underworld. But in doing so, he had committed a fatal strategic error. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was an act of violence so profound, so far beyond the pale, that it changed public perception forever. He was no longer a roguish folk hero, a provider of illicit fun. He was a monster, a butcher. He had become public enemy number one, and in Washington, a government that had largely been content to let Chicago police its own problems, decided that enough was enough. The annihilation on North Clark Street was the peak of Al Capone's power, but it was also the moment he signed his own death warrant. The echoes of those Tommy guns would follow him for the rest of his life, all the way to a federal prison cell. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. In the immediate aftermath of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a storm of public outrage erupted, unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. The gruesome newspaper photographs of the 7 slain men became a national symbol of the lawlessness that had gripped the country during Prohibition. The public, which had once winked at bootlegging and viewed gangsters like Capone as glamorous rebels, was now confronted with the horrific reality of their business. The romantic facade had been ripped away, revealing the cold, mechanized slaughter beneath. For Al Capone, basking in the Miami sun, the initial reports must have seemed like a triumph. His greatest rival, the North Side Gang, was broken, its leadership decapitated in a single decisive blow. He was now the unchallenged emperor of Chicago. But the shockwaves from the massacre were far greater than he could have anticipated. He had miscalculated the reaction, not of his underworld rivals, but of the legitimate world. The civic and business leaders of Chicago, who had long tolerated the city's corruption as a cost of doing business, were now terrified. The massacre wasn't just bad for public safety. It was bad for Chicago's reputation, bad for investment, bad for the city's future. A group of influential citizens formed a secret committee, which became known as the Secret Six. They pledged to use their wealth and influence to finally bring down Capone and clean up the city. They operated outside the corrupted official channels, hiring their own investigators and providing crucial support to the few law enforcement officials they could trust. The political pressure became immense. President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated, was appalled by the headlines. The brazen lawlessness of Chicago was a black eye on his administration and the nation. He convened a meeting with his top officials and demanded action. As he later wrote in his memoirs, he told them he wanted Capone convicted on federal charges and sent to prison. The order was clear: get Capone by any means necessary. This directive from the highest office in the land fundamentally changed the nature of the fight. It was no longer a local policing matter. It was now a top priority for the full might of the United States federal government. 2 federal agencies were tasked with the mission: the Treasury Department and the Department of Justice. The Treasury's Bureau of Prohibition, under the direction of Eliot Ness in Chicago, ramped up its efforts. Ness and his untouchables launched a series of high-profile raids on Capone's breweries and distilleries. They were a constant nuisance, destroying valuable equipment and confiscating thousands of gallons of illegal beer. While these raids cost Capone significant money and prestige, they were ultimately pinpricks against a vast and resilient empire. They could not land the knockout blow. The real threat, the one that would ultimately bring the giant down, was quieter, more patient, and far more lethal. It came from the Treasury's Special Intelligence Unit, a small group of elite accountants and investigators. Their leader on the Capone case was Frank J. Wilson, a man as different from Capone as one could imagine. Wilson was dogged, meticulous, and incorruptible. He didn't carry a Tommy gun. He carried a fountain pen. His battlefield was not the back alleys of Chicago, but the dusty archives of financial records. The legal strategy was based on a 1927 Supreme Court ruling, United States v. Sullivan, which held that even income from illegal activities was subject to federal income tax. The government didn't need to prove Capone was a murderer or a bootlegger. They just had to prove he had earned a substantial income and had willfully failed to pay taxes on it. For Capone, the immediate aftermath of the massacre brought a new kind of pressure. He was the most famous man in Chicago, and he could no longer operate in the shadows. He was summoned to appear before a federal grand jury in Chicago to testify about his knowledge of the bootlegging trade. Feigning illness, he tried to dodge the subpoena, but federal agents produced evidence that he had been well enough to attend horse races and travel. Faced with a contempt of court charge, he was forced to travel to Chicago. The journey itself was a media circus. In a clever move to avoid the press and potential assassins, Capone allowed himself to be arrested in Philadelphia on a minor charge of carrying a concealed weapon. He was sentenced to a year in prison, a term he served in relative comfort at the Eastern State Penitentiary. For Capone, it was a strategic retreat, a way to lie low while the heat from the massacre died down. He believed he was safe, untouchable. He had no physical assets in his name. He paid for everything in cash. He never signed a check or a receipt. He famously boasted, "They can't collect legal taxes from illegal money." He was wrong. While Capone sat in his Pennsylvania cell, Frank Wilson and his team were painstakingly piecing together the puzzle of his finances. It was a monumental task. They sifted through thousands of documents, interviewed hundreds of reluctant witnesses, and followed a money trail that was deliberately obscured. They couldn't find a single document linking Capone directly to any income. The break in the case came from an unlikely source. During a raid on one of Capone's gambling dens, agents found a set of ledger books. These books, meticulously kept by the casino's bookkeeper, detailed the vast profits from the operation and, crucially, showed payouts to a man identified only as Al. This was the first piece of concrete evidence. The team then began to build a case based on net worth expenditure. They documented Capone's lavish lifestyle, his expensive suits, his armored cars, his Florida mansion, his extravagant spending, and contrasted it with his official claim of having no income. They were constructing a picture of a man living like a millionaire while telling the government he was penniless. The unraveling had begun. It was not happening in a hail of gunfire, but in the quiet, methodical work of accountants and lawyers. Capone, the master of violence and intimidation, was being ensnared in a web of paper and ink. He had built an empire on the premise that cash was king and that the law could always be bought. He was about to learn that there was one power in the land that could not be bribed, one ledger that could not be cooked: the United States Treasury. The noose was tightening, slowly and silently. Chapter 8. The Paper Trail to Perdition. By the time Al Capone was released from prison in Pennsylvania in March of 1930, the world he returned to had changed. The stock market crash of 1929 had plunged the nation into the Great Depression. The public mood had soured. The freewheeling, jazz-age decadence that had fueled his rise was replaced by breadlines and desperation. The public's tolerance for a man who flaunted his illegal wealth had evaporated. He was no longer a folk hero. He was a symbol of a corrupt and broken system. Unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon, Capone returned to Chicago and attempted to resume his role as the city's benevolent dictator. He doubled down on his public relations efforts, opening one of the first soup kitchens in Chicago to feed the unemployed. Every day his kitchen served 3 hot meals to thousands of jobless men, no questions asked. It was a gesture of genuine charity, but also a calculated move to shore up his public image. He told a reporter, "I'm doing my best for them, and I hope they'll not forget it." But the federal government had not forgotten its mission. The two-pronged attack continued relentlessly. While Elliot Ness and his untouchables continued their spectacular raids, grabbing headlines and disrupting operations, Frank Wilson and the Treasury agents were closing in. The pressure on Capone's organization was immense. Wilson's team began subpoenaing Capone's associates, one by one, squeezing them for information. They offered immunity in exchange for testimony, turning the outfit's code of silence against itself. The key was to find an insider, someone who could decipher the ledgers and testify to Capone's control of the empire. They found their man in Leslie Shumway, a bookkeeper for one of Capone's dog track operations. Terrified for his life, Shumway agreed to cooperate and was hidden away by federal agents. The most critical breakthrough, however, came from the discovery of 3 crucial ledgers from a Cicero gambling hall known as the Ship. These books were a detailed record of the casino's income and expenses over a 2-year period, showing a net profit of over $500,000. And, most importantly, they contained entries explicitly linking the profits to Al. The government now had the smoking gun, physical evidence of a massive income that Capone had never declared. The grand jury was convened. On June 5, 1931, after years of painstaking investigation, the federal government handed down its indictment. But it wasn't for murder, bootlegging, or racketeering. It was for 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. The government alleged that between 1924 and 1929, Capone had earned over $1 million, on which he had paid no taxes. The man who had terrorized a city, who was responsible for hundreds of deaths, was going to be tried as a tax cheat. Capone and his lawyers were initially confident. They viewed the charges as a nuisance, a technicality they could easily beat. They entered into negotiations with the U.S. Attorney, George E. Q. Johnson. A plea bargain was struck. Capone would plead guilty in exchange for a relatively light sentence of 2.5 years. It seemed like another victory for Capone. He would serve a short, comfortable sentence, and then return to his empire. On the day of the hearing, Capone appeared in court, smug and confident, but he had underestimated the judge, James H. Wilkerson. When the terms of the plea deal were announced, Judge Wilkerson stunned the courtroom. He refused to be bound by any prearranged deal. He famously stated, "It is time for somebody to impress upon this defendant that it is a crime to violate the income tax law." He told Capone he could let his guilty plea stand and the judge would determine the sentence, or he could withdraw the plea and go to trial. The deal was off. Capone was trapped. He had publicly admitted his guilt, and now he was facing a hostile judge and the prospect of a long prison term. He had no choice but to withdraw his plea and stand trial. The trial of Al Capone began on October 5, 1931. It was one of the most sensational trials in American history. The government's case, presented by U.S. Attorney Johnson, was a mountain of financial evidence. They put Capone's lavish spending on display for the jury, detailing his purchases of custom suits, diamond jewelry, and fine furniture, all paid for in cash. They called his own employees to the stand, men who testified to his control over the various illegal enterprises. Leslie Shumway, the terrified bookkeeper, provided damning testimony, directly linking Capone to the gambling profits. But Capone's team had one last card to play. They had a reputation for fixing problems, and a jury was just another problem to be fixed. Capone's enforcer, Frank Nitti, set about bribing and intimidating the entire jury panel. The plan was simple: buy a hung jury or an acquittal. They were confident they had succeeded. But Frank Wilson and his Treasury agents were one step ahead. They had gotten wind of the jury tampering plot. On the morning the trial was set to begin, as the lawyers prepared their opening statements, Judge Wilkerson made a stunning move. He announced that he had become aware of somebody attempting to interfere with the jury. Then, in a move of brilliant legal theater, he ordered the bailiff call in the jury from Judge Edwards' courtroom. He had swapped the entire jury panel at the last minute with a fresh panel from another trial that had just concluded. Capone and his lawyers were aghast. Their hand-picked, friendly jury was gone, replaced by 12 ordinary citizens from the suburbs who had not been tainted or terrified. Capone was seen slumping in his chair, his face pale. He knew, in that moment, that the game was over. The trial proceeded. The defense was weak, arguing that Capone was merely a big spender, a philanthropist, whose wealth came from the generosity of friends and admirers. The jury didn't buy it. On October 17, 1931, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. They found Al Capone guilty on 5 of the 22 counts of tax evasion. A week later, Judge Wilkerson delivered the sentence. He sentenced Capone to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion at the time. He was also fined $50,000 and ordered to pay court costs. As the sentence was read, Capone stood motionless. The King of Chicago, the man who had built an empire on violence and corruption, the man who thought he was above the law, had been brought down by a team of accountants. He had not been defeated by a rival gangster's Tommy gun, but by the relentless, methodical pursuit of a paper trail. The government had proven that the pen was indeed mightier than the sword, or in this case, the Tommy gun. The paper trail had led not to a rival's headquarters, but to the gates of a federal penitentiary. It was the end of his reign, the beginning of his long, slow fall into oblivion. Chapter 9. The Rock and the Rot. On May 3, 1932, Alphonse Capone, now federal prisoner number 40886, boarded a train under heavy guard, bound for the U.S. penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. For the former King of Chicago, it was a humiliating descent. But even in prison, Capone's influence was not entirely extinguished. Atlanta was a conventional federal prison, and with his money and connections, Capone was able to corrupt the system from the inside. He bribed guards for special privileges, receiving comfortable furniture for his cell, extra rations, and the freedom to essentially run his criminal empire from behind bars. He was still a king, albeit a caged one. His fellow inmates treated him with deference and fear. He was, for a time, the big shot of the Atlanta penitentiary. But the federal government was not finished with him. They had built a new kind of prison, a fortress designed specifically for the most dangerous, incorrigible, and high-profile criminals in the federal system. It was located on a barren, windswept island in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, a place of treacherous currents and frigid waters. It was called Alcatraz. Alcatraz was not designed for rehabilitation. It was designed to break men, to strip them of their identity, their influence, and their hope. The philosophy was simple: one prisoner to a cell, strict silence for much of the day, minimal contact with the outside world, and absolutely no special privileges. The warden, James A.T. Johnston, was a stern disciplinarian who famously told new inmates, "You are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Anything else that you get is a privilege." In August of 1934, Capone and a group of other high-risk prisoners were secretly put on a guarded train for the cross-country journey to California. When he arrived at Alcatraz, he was no longer Al Capone, the feared gangster. He was now federal prisoner, AZ-85. The transformation was immediate and total. The fancy suits were replaced with a standard-issue prison uniform. The diamond pinky ring was gone. The guards, hand-picked for their integrity, were immune to his bribes and intimidation. He was just another number in a system designed to crush individuality. The other inmates, a collection of the nation's hardest criminals, did not see him as a king. They saw him as a big shots who needed to be taken down a peg, a whop with the clap, a reference to the disease that was slowly beginning to consume him. For years, Capone had been suffering from syphilis, which he had likely contracted as a young man in a Brooklyn brothel. He had never sought proper treatment, and the disease had progressed to its tertiary stage, neurosyphilis, a condition where the bacteria begins to attack the brain and central nervous system. The effects were becoming increasingly apparent. His once sharp mind began to dull. He became prone to erratic behavior, confusion, and fits of rage. He was no longer the cunning strategist. He was a sick, deteriorating man. His attempts to maintain his big shot status in the harsh democracy of Alcatraz were met with ridicule and violence. He tried to bribe his way into better jobs and was rebuffed. He tried to organize a strike among the inmates over poor working conditions, and was ignored. The other prisoners saw him as a fraud, a man whose power had evaporated the moment he stepped onto the rock. The ultimate humiliation came in 1936. While working in the prison laundry, Capone was standing in line waiting for a haircut. Another inmate, a Texas bank robber named James Texas Lucas, accused Capone of cutting in line. When Capone ignored him, Lucas grabbed a pair of scissors from the barber's station and stabbed him repeatedly in the back and arm. Capone survived, but the incident was a stark illustration of his fall from grace. The man who once commanded an army of killers had been shanked in a prison laundry over a place in line. The physical decay was mirrored by his mental decline. The neurosyphilis was relentless. He would have conversations with long-dead gangsters, become paranoid, and suffer from delusions. He was given a job in the prison band, where he played the banjo, a pathetic image of the once feared mob boss. He wrote letters to his son Sonny that were often rambling and incoherent. The man who had terrorized a city was now a shell, haunted by the ghosts of his past and the disease ravaging his brain. By 1938, his condition had deteriorated so severely that he was transferred to the prison hospital. His sentence was set to expire in 1939, but he was no longer a threat to anyone. He was a broken man, physically and mentally. The federal government had succeeded beyond its wildest expectations. They had not just jailed Capone, they had dismantled him. Alcatraz had been the perfect weapon. It had isolated him, stripped him of his power, and allowed the rot within him, both physical and psychological, to consume what was left. When he was finally released from federal custody on November 16, 1939, he was not the swaggering, defiant gangster who had entered the system. He was a shuffling, mentally vacant man with the cognitive abilities of a 12-year-old. He was taken by his family to a Baltimore hospital for treatment, before being allowed to return to his Palm Island estate in Florida. The king had returned to his castle, but the throne was empty. The empire was gone, now run by his former lieutenants, like Frank Nitti, men who had no use for a sick, mentally incompetent former boss. The Rock had done its job. It had taken America's most notorious gangster and turned him into a ghost. The long, slow process of his final fade from the world had begun. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Silence. The final years of Al Capone's life were spent in a gilded cage of his own making. He returned to his sprawling villa at 93 Palm Avenue in Miami Beach, a place that had once been his sanctuary and his southern command post. Now, it was his sanatorium, a place of quiet, sun-drenched decline. The man who emerged from prison was a ghost of his former self. The neurosyphilis had ravaged his mind, leaving him childlike and often disoriented. The once sharp, calculating brain that had built a criminal empire was now clouded and confused. He would spend his days fishing from his private dock, playing cards, or wandering the grounds of his estate, sometimes having long, animated conversations with people who were not there. His loyal wife, May, stood by him, protecting him from the outside world and the few remaining enemies who might seek to settle old scores. His son, Sonny, and his brothers managed his affairs. But there were no affairs to manage. The Chicago outfit, now under the control of others, had moved on. They sent him a modest pension out of a mixture of pity and respect for the old traditions. But he held no power, no influence. He was a relic, a living monument to a bygone era. The press would occasionally try to get a glimpse of the fallen gangster, but the family maintained a strict wall of privacy. The world that had been so fascinated by his rise seemed to have forgotten him in his fall. He was no longer public enemy number one. He was a medical case, a cautionary tale. He suffered a stroke on January 21st, 1947. He rallied briefly, but then contracted pneumonia. On January 25th, 1947, Alphonse Gabriel Capone died of cardiac arrest in his home. He was 48 years old. His death was quiet, a stark contrast to the violent, noisy life he had lived. He was buried in a modest grave in Chicago, the city he had once owned. Later, his remains were moved to a family plot in a different cemetery to deter vandals and grave robbers. The legacy of Al Capone is complex and enduring. He was, without question, a brutal and ruthless criminal, responsible for countless acts of violence, corruption, and murder. He built an empire on the blood of his rivals and the subversion of the law. He was a parasite on the city of Chicago, a man who profited from human weakness and political decay. Yet he became something more than just a gangster. He became an icon, a myth. He is the archetypal American gangster, the template for 1,000 characters in film and fiction. His name is synonymous with the Roaring Twenties, with Prohibition, with speakeasies, Tommy guns, and the violent, chaotic birth of modern organized crime. He represents a uniquely American story, the immigrant's son who, denied a path to legitimate success, seizes power through ambition, intelligence, and a complete disregard for the rules. He was a dark reflection of the American dream, a man who achieved wealth and fame through the very vices the society publicly condemned but privately craved. His fall is as significant as his rise. The successful prosecution of Al Capone for tax evasion was a landmark moment for American law enforcement. It demonstrated that even the most powerful and insulated criminal could be brought down by the patient, methodical application of federal law. It established financial investigation as a primary tool in the fight against organized crime, a tactic that would be used for decades to come. The story of his downfall, the quiet work of accountants defeating a man impervious to bullets, became a lesson in the true nature of power. But perhaps his most lasting legacy is the questions his life forces us to ask. How could a man so violent become a celebrated public figure? What does his rise say about the society that allowed it to happen? He was a product of his time, of failed social policy in the form of prohibition, of systemic urban corruption, and of a public that was often ambivalent, and even admiring of his rebellion against authority. He held a mirror up to America, and the reflection was not always a flattering one. Today, the speakeasies are gone. Prohibition is a distant memory. The battlefields of the Chicago beer wars are now quiet city streets, but the echoes of Al Capone remain. They can be heard in the stories we tell about crime and power, in the enduring fascination with the outlaw, and in the quiet understanding that the line between the legitimate world and the underworld is sometimes thinner than we like to believe. The boy from Brooklyn with 3 scars on his face is long dead, but the legend of Scarface, for better or for worse, is immortal.